Hi, this is Mahavandas. Welcome to Simple Gita, Chapter 1. This chapter is entitled Observing the Armies on the Battlefield of Kuruksetra. If you haven't already, please check out my video entitled Setting the Scene, which will give you some background on what we're hearing here in this first chapter. Now let's have a short overview of Chapter 1. Sanjaya describes the scene on the battlefield in response to Dhrtarastra's inquiry. We hear Duryodhana estimating the strength of the Panadavas' army in a report to his military teacher, and Arjuna asking Krishna to drive his chariot between the two armies, so that he can also gauge the strength of the opposition and see those who wanted to fight against him. Then we hear Arjuna's reaction to seeing his family and friends before him, as he envisions their impending deaths. He decides not to fight and gives reasons for why he thinks this is the best decision. Let's check out the first verse and purport for this chapter from Bhagavad Gita as it is. Dhrtarastra said, O Sanjaya, after my sons and the sons of Pandu assembled in the place of pilgrimage at Kuruksetra, desiring to fight, what did they do? Srila Prabhupada's purport. Bhagavad Gita is the widely read theistic science summarized in the Gita Mahatmya, glorification of the Gita. There it says that one should read Bhagavad Gita very scrutinizingly with the help of a person who is a devotee of Sri Krishna and try to understand it without personally motivated interpretations. The example of clear understanding is there in the Bhagavad Gita itself, in the way the teaching is understood by Arjuna, who heard the Gita directly from the Lord. If someone is fortunate enough to understand the Bhagavad Gita in that line of disciplic succession without motivated interpretation, then he surpasses all studies of Vedic wisdom and all scriptures of the world. One will find in the Bhagavad Gita all that is contained in other scriptures, but the reader will also find things which are not to be found elsewhere. That is the specific standard of the Gita. It is the perfect theistic science because it is directly spoken by the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Lord Sri Krishna. The topics discussed by Dhrtarastra and Sanjaya, as described in the Mahabharata, form the basic principle for this great philosophy. It is understood that this philosophy evolved on the battlefield of Kuruksetra, which is a sacred place of pilgrimage from the immemorial time of the Vedic age. It was spoken by the Lord when he was present personally on this planet for the guidance of mankind. The word Dharmaksetra, a place where religious rituals are performed, is significant because on the battlefield of Kuruksetra, the Supreme Personality of Godhead was present on the side of Arjuna. Dhrtarastra, the father of the Kurus, was highly doubtful about the possibility of his son's ultimate victory. In his doubt, he inquired from his secretary Sanjaya, what did they do? He was confident that both his sons and the sons of his younger brother Pandu were assembled in that field of Kuruksetra for a determined engagement of the war. Still, his inquiry is significant. He did not want a compromise between the cousins and brothers, and he wanted to be sure of the fate of his sons on the battlefield. Because the battle was arranged to be fought at Kuruksetra, which is mentioned elsewhere in the Vedas as a place of worship, even for the denizens of heaven, Dhrtarastra became very fearful about the influence of the holy place on the outcome of the battle. He knew very well that this would influence Arjuna and the sons of Pandu favourably, because by nature they were all virtuous. Sanjaya was a student of Vyasa, and therefore, by the mercy of Vyasa, Sanjaya was able to envision the battlefield of Kuruksetra, even while he was in the room of Dhrtarastra. And so Dhrtarastra asked him about the situation on the battlefield. Both the Pandavas and the sons of Dhrtarastra belong to the same family, but Dhrtarastra's mind is disclosed herein. He deliberately claimed only his sons as Kurus, and he separated the sons of Pandu from the family heritage. One can thus understand the specific position of Dhrtarastra in his relationship with his nephews, the sons of Pandu. As in the paddy field, the unnecessary plants are taken out, So it is expected from the very beginning of these topics that in the religious field of Kuruksetra, where the father of religion, Sri Krishna, was present, the unwanted plants like Dhrtarastra's son, Duryodhana, and others would be wiped out, and the thoroughly religious persons headed by Yudhishthira would be established by the Lord. This is the significance of the words Dharmakshatra and Kuruksetra, apart from their historical and Vedic importance. Let's go over the key points here in chapter 1. First key point is Dhrtarastra's inquiry to Sanjaya. As we just heard, O Sanjaya, after my sons and the sons of Pandu assembled in the place of pilgrimage at Kuruksetra, desiring to fight, what did they do? He asks this question out of fear, and as Srila Prabhupada explains in his purport, that fear was based on the fact that the battle was being fought at Kuruksetra, which was a holy place of pilgrimage. Why was he afraid about this? Because he was thinking that the effect of the holy place on the battle would come out in the favor of the sons of his brother, Pandu, not his own sons, headed by Duryodhana. He was worried that the holy place would influence his sons to compromise with their cousins, the Pandavas, and he was also worried that even if they didn't compromise, that they went ahead and fought the battle, that the holy place would influence the Pandavas' ultimate victory, because as Srila Prabhupada explained, by nature they were all virtuous. The next key point we get here is Dhrtarastra's eldest son Duryodhana describing the armies on the battlefield to his military commander Dronacharya. He does this both with diplomacy and also with concealed fear. Duryodhana goes to Drona and he describes the soldiers on the Pandavas' side, the key soldiers, and he describes the key soldiers on his own side, and he compares their strength. And while concealing his fear of the Pandavas' army, he rightly concludes that he has much greater military force than the Pandavas. But he is still afraid of the Pandavas. The next key point in the chapter is the blowing of various conch shells, which give signs of victory for the Pandavas. So conch shells are blown by generals of both the armies, and this is to increase the morale of the soldiers and also to signal the start of the battle. Now, the difference in the sounding of the conch shells of the Pandavas, headed by Lord Krishna, and the conch shells of the opposite party, headed by Bhishma, was that the sound produced by the conch shells blown by Lord Krishna and the Pandavas was transcendental. And the effect of that was that it actually shattered the hearts of the sons of Dhrtarastra. It shattered the hearts of the opposition. Morale is an important part of military activities, and the morale of the Kauravas was actually just shattered by the sound, the transcendental sound produced by the conch shells of Lord Krishna and the Pandavas. So in this way, in the blowing of the conch shells, even before the battle began, there were signs of victory for the Pandavas. The next key point we get in the chapter is Arjuna observing the armies. So Arjuna desires to see the supporters of Duryodhana, and he asks Krishna to drive his chariot between the two armies. And what happens then? Seeing all the different grades of friends and relatives who are present on both sides, he becomes overwhelmed with compassion. We'll read some text here from the Gita in this section. There, Arjuna could see, within the midst of the armies of both parties, his fathers, grandfathers, teachers, maternal uncles, brothers, sons, grandsons, friends, and also his fathers-in-law and well-wishers. When the son of Kunti, Arjuna, saw all these different grades of friends and relatives, he became overwhelmed with compassion and spoke thus. My dear Krishna, seeing my friends and relatives present before me in such a fighting spirit, I feel the limbs of my body quivering and my mouth drying up. My whole body is trembling. My hair is standing on end. My bow, Gandiva, is slipping from my hand, and my skin is burning. I am now unable to stand here any longer. I am forgetting myself, and my mind is reeling. I see only causes of misfortune, O Krishna, killer of the Keshi demon. So here we have Arjuna becoming overwhelmed with the gravity of the situation. And the next key point in the chapter is Arjuna's reasons, based on his experience here in between the two armies, of why he shouldn't fight the battle. The first reason is compassion. Because Arjuna is not an ordinary military man. He's a saintly man. He's a bhakti yogi. And as a saintly person, Arjuna naturally feels compassion for the soldiers on the battlefield. Not even just his own soldiers, but the soldiers even of the enemy. He doesn't want to see any of them die. So, foreseeing their imminent deaths, he becomes overwhelmed with compassion, and this is his first reason for not wanting to fight. He doesn't want to kill all these soldiers on the battlefield out of compassion for them. His next reason is that he foresees no happiness in this battle, even if they win. He thinks that even if he wins the battle, he won't be able to share the opulences of victory with so many of his friends and family, because so many of them will have died in the battle. So, why fight? If you're not even going to enjoy, even if you win, what's the point? You have no one to share the spoils of victory with. So this is his second reason, for seeing no happiness even in victory. His third reason, fear of karmic reactions. We learn from yoga wisdom that every action has a reaction. You've probably heard the saying, what goes around comes around. So that's a very simplistic understanding of the law of karma. And Arjuna is aware of that law, not just in a simplistic way, but in a detailed way. And he understands that every action has a reaction which will accrue to him in his next life. So this is the law of karma. So Arjuna is worried about reactions that will accrue to him from fighting in this battle, reactions that will determine for him the type of body he will get in his next life, and the amount of happiness and distress that he will experience in the next life. All those things will be determined by the law of karma according to the quality of his actions in this life. So, he's afraid of karmic reactions for killing so many people in this battle. That's his third reason. And his fourth reason, the harmful effects of destroying the family. Arjuna understands that material prosperity is based on stable families. That's the foundation for material happiness and prosperity. And he's thinking that because so many men will die here on the battlefield, that stability of the family unit will be disturbed, and therefore the peace and prosperity of society will disappear. So this is his fourth reason. Now, don't these all sound like very good reasons? Compassion, foreseeing no happiness even in victory, fear of karmic reactions, and the harmful effects of destroying the family? They're very good reasons. But although they are good arguments, they're only good arguments on the temporary platform, on the platform of the temporary good. They don't take into account the ultimate good. And the purpose of human life, as we hear in the Bhagavad Gita, is to understand and execute the ultimate good for all beings. Therefore, as we'll see in the next chapter, Krishna will reject all these good arguments for Arjuna not fighting the battle, and he'll actually criticize Arjuna for presenting himself as a learned person when actually being uninformed. What is he uninformed about? He's uninformed about the ultimate good. So Srila Prabhupada explains the nature of this illusion that affects all conditioned souls in this world, as perfectly demonstrated here by Arjuna. He explains, due to his impatience, Arjuna was unable to stay on the battlefield, and he was forgetting himself on account of this weakness of his mind. Excessive attachment for material things puts a man in such a bewildering condition of existence. Bhayam dvitiyabi naveshata syat. That's a verse from the Srimad Bhagavatam, the graduate study to the Bhagavad Gita. It means that such fearfulness and loss of mental equilibrium take place in persons who are too affected by material conditions. Arjuna envisioned only painful reverses in the battlefield. He would not be happy even by gaining victory over the foe. The words Nimitani and Viparitani are significant. When a man sees only frustration in his expectations, he thinks, why am I here? I'm sure we've all felt like that sometimes. Why am I here in this situation? Everyone is interested in himself and his own welfare. No one is interested in the Supreme Self. Arjuna is showing ignorance of his real self-interest by Krishna's will. One's real self-interest lies in Vishnu or Krishna. The conditioned soul forgets this and therefore suffers material pains. Arjuna thought that his victory in the battle would only be a cause of lamentation for him. So then, after becoming overwhelmed by the gravity of the situation, Arjuna gives his final verdict at the end of the chapter. He says, alas, how strange it is that we are preparing to commit greatly sinful acts. Driven by the desire to enjoy royal happiness, we are intent on killing our own kinsmen. Better for me if the sons of Dhrtarastra, weapons in hand, were to kill me unarmed and unresisting on the battlefield. Arjuna, having thus spoken on the battlefield, cast aside his bow and arrows and sat down on the chariot, his mind overwhelmed with grief. Again, I'm sure we've all felt like that sometimes. It's very normal in material life to encounter these kinds of crisis situations and to wonder, as Srila Prabhupada said in his purport, why am I here? But these times in our lives can be used to our ultimate advantage if we take them as opportunities to inquire into the higher, to try to understand the actual nature of the world, of ourselves, and our real purpose here. And that is what Arjuna does in the next chapter. So this first chapter is especially important because it describes the magnitude of the problem, of the crisis that Arjuna was facing. It was so overwhelming that he, as a renowned military general, has the reaction of dropping his weapons, sitting down on the chariot, and succumbing to basically what amounts to a psychological breakdown. This chapter is often called the Yoga of Crisis, and we can see here the magnitude of that crisis. A situation in which he's duty-bound to fight and kill his own friends and family. Certainly, that's an unprecedented crisis. But we'll also see how that seemingly insurmountable problem was solved by hearing the Bhagavad Gita from Krishna. And the takeaway from this is that if hearing the Bhagavad Gita from Krishna can solve Arjuna's problem, Arjuna's crisis, then certainly it can solve anyone's problems. Srila Prabhupada explains that although Arjuna was bewildered, he had the quality of soft-heartedness, which would help him to ultimately attain enlightenment. Let's summarise chapter 1. In this first chapter, we've heard Dhrtarastra's inquiry to Sanjaya. What did they do on the battlefield, my sons and the sons of my brother Pandu? We've heard Duryodhana's fear and diplomacy in describing the armies of both parties. We've heard the blowing of conch shells by the generals of both sides, which evidenced signs of victory for the Panadavas. We've heard Arjuna observing the armies and seeing all different kinds of friends and relatives present on the battlefield. We've heard that he became overwhelmed with compassion, and then he gave 4 reasons for not wanting to fight the battle. Those reasons were compassion for the soldiers on the battlefield, he didn't want to see them die, foreseeing no happiness even in victory, because he would have practically no one to share the spoils of victory with, they would have all died in the battle. Fear of karmic reactions, what goes around comes around, he understood that. He was afraid that reactions would come back to him for killing all these soldiers on the battlefield, and this way he would suffer in the future. And the harmful effects of destroying the family. So many men would die in the battle, this would destroy so many families, and in this way the stability and prosperity of society would disappear. And although these are good arguments, they're all based on the temporary good, not the ultimate good. And the purpose of the Bhagavad Gita is to help us to understand and execute the ultimate good for all beings. Finally, we heard that Arjuna cast aside his bow and arrows, deciding not to fight, his mind overwhelmed with grief. Srila Prabhupada comments, while observing the situation of his enemy, Arjuna stood up on the chariot, but he was so afflicted with lamentation that he sat down again, setting aside his bow and arrows. Such a kind and soft-hearted person in the devotional service of the Lord is fit to receive self-knowledge. This sets the scene then for the speaking of the Bhagavad Gita by Krishna, which begins in chapter 2. So let's have a short preview of that chapter. Arjuna continues to reveal his doubts about fighting, but agrees to take Krishna's guidance, which is a watershed moment in the Gita. Krishna, as the source of all energies and perfect authority, then explains in summary the knowledge which will solve Arjuna's dilemma, defeating point by point all of Arjuna's reasons for not wanting to fight. Thank you so much for joining me in this class today on Chapter 1, Observing the Armies on the Battlefield of Kuruksetra, and I look forward to seeing you in the next class on Chapter 2, the contents of the Gita summarized.